Morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the snow or the cold to join us today. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here, and we're really glad to have you all here for what we hope will be a very interesting and engaging discussion on how to think about China's economy and what's happening. I'm just back from China myself, and certainly my impression was that a lot more pessimism with regard to where the economy is and its prospects. People becoming concerned that the traditional tools that the regime uses to keep the economy going aren't having the intended effects, and so on. And then just some real concerns that a lot of the numbers are looking very negative and not looking to turn around anytime soon. So we have a very distinguished panel with us today. Anne Stevenson-Young, who co-founded J Capital Research in late 2007 and is the firm's research director. Her cover areas include solar, internet, medical devices, property, some consumer and direct sales, and China's macroeconomy. Anne was formerly co-founder of a group of online media businesses called Blue Bamboo Ventures, and also founded and operated a CRM software company. Clarity Data Systems, and a publishing company whose flagship magazine is City Weekend. Over 25 years in China, Anne has also worked as an industry analyst and trade advocate, heading the U.S. Information Technology Office, and 1993 to 97, the China operations of the U.S.-China Business Council, so obviously deep expertise. Bob Davis is a senior editor of the Wall Street Journal, who economic and other issues in the 2016 presidential campaign. From 2011 to 2014, he covered the Chinese economy from Beijing and still misses China despite the pollution. He and his wife, Deborah Bruno, are writing a book on their experiences in the country, which will be published by the Journal. Until October 2011, he was international economics correspondent in Washington, D.C., and from 2004 to 2011, he was the Journal's Latin America bureau chief. And then from 2002 to 2004, he was the Washington, D.C. news editor responsible for coverage of economic policy making. And then Scott Kennedy, deputy director here in the Freeman Chair and the head of our new program on Chinese business and political economy at CSIS. Scott is a leading authority on China's economic policy and its global economic relations. Specific areas of focus for Scott include industrial policy, business lobbying, multinational business challenges in China, Chinese participation in global economic regimes, and philanthropy. And for over 14 years before joining us here at CSIS, Scott was a professor at Indiana University, and prior to was director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business, and he was founding academic director of IU's China office. So with that, I think, Anne, we're going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Really, I'm first.
Yep. And we'll go from there.
I'm ready for that. But, well, thank you. I'll just sit here if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Because I would really like to make this a discussion and an exchange rather than a presentation. But let me try to set some of the. Oh, can I change? Can I move these?
We could bring the mobile.
Or,
that's a mobile. You can just bring that over to your lap if you'd like.
bring what over to my lap?
Does that come over?
I don't know what that is.
think
Oh,
that would just-
keyboard.
The keyboard. Yeah, they still have these for some reason.
Okay, well,
go.
I mean, it would be boring to go through anyway, but probably I will forget otherwise what I'm going to talk about, so we'll see whether this kind of works one way or the other. No. Anyway, we'll figure that out. What do you think?
Enter would be my guess.
Enter.
Did that not work? Down
Enter.
here?
No.
There we go.
There we go.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Oh, and I must have gotten some flash going there. I didn't realize that. Okay, so here's the way that I'd like to set the sort of framework of discussion. I find in my work that the attitude toward China internationally has shifted very dramatically over the last 2 years. And now the people I talk to, mostly the people I talk to are in money management. So they're in money management in the US and Europe, but also in politics and other areas. And I find that now the scope or the spectrum of discussion is China going to have a financial crisis soon, or do we have 2 years of muddling through and is China sort of turning into Japan? That's the range of discussion now. The discussion doesn't even include, oh, well, is China, China is expanding and whatever problems it's getting through and the consumer is becoming more important and it's economically important. That stuff is gone. Also, all the number of times I was asked in the pre-2012 period to be on panels about innovation and Chinese technology was really, you know, I honestly would rather have a root canal than go talk about that again. It was just a huge topic of discussion, disappeared. Now, it may be that people are sick of me, which is also probably the case, but I think also the topic has dwindled in importance because it's become clear that Chinese technology is not projecting into the international world anymore as the financing for technology and other industries falls. So what I'd like to start with is, why does debt really matter? So debt in China, we can all agree, is enormous. There's a range of estimates for the size of debt compared with GDP. There's discussion about the size of debt, how much is double counting. There's discussion about the size of GDP. But I think we can pretty much all agree that it's in the range of 200 to 300% of GDP. Outstanding loans from the banks, outstanding loans from the shadow banks, and other elements of debt. So why does this matter? Because the economic, let's say that the average interest rate on debt is about 7%. Right now, the long-term benchmark rate is 6.15. The shadow banks charge upwards of 10%. So if you average it out, it might be, you know, 6 or 7%. So if you triple that, that means you have to get 18 to 20% GDP real growth every year just to cover the debt. And clearly, that's not happening. And so if that doesn't happen, then either you have to write off debt, or you have to, you have to come to some sort of, it's kind of odd how it's flashing. Is it doing that up there? I guess it doesn't matter. So you have to, you have to come to some, some resolution of that. You have to write off debt, or you have to, do something about it. So what the authorities have been doing, I think the fundamental problem for the authorities is that obviously there's a lot of debt being written off and being moved over to asset management companies or being quietly negotiated down, but it's nowhere near enough. And right now, servicing debt is consuming virtually all the credit resources in the economy. So this makes it very difficult for anybody else, people to get credit or get capital in order to build new capacity. There's also the problem that new capacity is not really in demand. But right now you have a situation, I would say, going on now for about 2 years, where you have almost a zombie economy effect, where you have virtually all the credit in the economy being issued to roll over old debt, very, very low credit demand in the rest of the economy, declining prices, particularly from manufacturers, an excess of commodities, excess of production, and very low demand. So that's the situation we're in right now. Growth in the economy, I would put, we don't do independent macroeconomic forecasting because the data set is too difficult to work with. So we use all the different data sets out of China all the time, and we do primary research to triangulate. And on a kind of anecdotal basis, growth in the economy would be a little bit sub-zero this quarter. You don't want to call it a recession because you don't necessarily have several quarters in a row that are sub-zero, but there's no way the economy is growing much right now. If you look at the simplest metrics, even for last year, leaving aside this quarter, and you always sort of drop into a data hole in the first quarter because of Spring Festival, but even looking at last year, we had domestic steel demand down by about 5%. We had, depending on how you read the statistics, but our point of view is that cement demand dropped by about 1 to 2%. It went negative last August. Freight and electric power appeared to go negative in May and not really recover. There were, basically all the industrial economy started to gear down and go tip negative around about May last year. It's very hard to come out to The financial services industry grew. I would argue that the consumer industry did not grow, but that's a very controversial point of view. Whichever way you calculate, you come to a very low level of growth, definitely negative in the current quarter. So, whoops, I seem to have lost, there we go. So we have a situation now where we have a very kind of depressed economy, not in the technical sense, but a kind of low depressed economy, and we have massive overcapacity in industry. So, for example, petrochemicals is an industry that I looked at pretty carefully a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, it was already running at about 65% capacity. Construction machinery is one that I know fairly well. That was running at 50% production capacity about a year ago. Steel is at around, it's gone from 85 to about 65, 70. So in major portions of the economy, cement also is certainly under 80%. Major portions of the economy, you have massive overcapacity. Clearly, it will take years of growth to fill up that capacity. So you have on one hand, and these are just exemplars of those issues, you have massive overcapacity, declining and probably negative growth. And so more and more difficulty filling up that capacity, adding to this phenomenon of very low loan demand and very sort of low demand in the economy. Aluminum is a case that I just thought I'd lay out for you because you have this contrast between the need of the governments to create growth through production targets and the actual demand in the economy. So one sort of aside comment that I might make, because I'm sure to some of you the idea that China is growing negatively is very shocking, and you don't agree with that. But I would submit that the GDP number out of China is not a calculated result of data, but instead a production target. And I think that most in the central government would agree with that point of view. The production target is provided because the principal owner of state industry, SASAC, is the approver of all budgets for state enterprises, and budgets are made according to a very rigid formula, which is essentially GDP growth times this particular industry's historical proportion of GDP growth, or growth against GDP, X times Y equals Z, that's your target for the year. So if the government were to say, actually, GDP grew at 3% last year, and I think it'll grow at 1.8% this year, that sends a signal throughout state industry that your production target is now, if you're steel and you've traditionally grown at 1 point above GDP, then it would be 2.8. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can't do that. So the consumer sector I can spend time on if anybody cares about it, but I believe that the consumer sector actually is tracking close to zero as well. The number out of the NBS is the worst number that we have. What we do more commonly is just look at all the results on the A-share exchange. You have about, I don't know, 160 or so companies in consumer industries that are listed there. If you simply aggregate all of their revenue, you clear out the companies that didn't exist last quarter or do exist this quarter or disappeared this quarter, whatever, you come to negative growth in gross revenue of 2% at mid-year last year, of 6% in the third quarter. And that's not even clearing out investment-driven growth and acquisitions and mergers. So I think it's pretty clear that if the strongest consumer companies in China are seeing a decline in gross revenue, then the consumer industry is not in good shape. Am I going too slow?
No.
Okay.
I think you're on target.
All right. So as we all know, property is somewhere on the order of 20% of the economy, depending on which portions of property you count. And property has been tracking negative for some time. Sales of property are negative. Prices of property, hard to say. Right now, the indices that are provided are negative on pricing. And construction completions last year went up, and the amount of property in the chain went up because there's a huge sort of, there's a python effect, or there's a pig in a python effect. But starts last year were regularly declined and declined quite sharply, and I think we'll see construction down this year. If steel dropped about 4.8% last year, this is not netting out the exports, but domestic steel demand dropped about 4.8%. This year it will be down at least 10%. So that's good for the environment, but bad for materials. These are just a few, like, you know, a few tourist shots from my cell phone about overcapacity in housing to try to drive, I think to this audience, we don't really need to dwell on it, but to a less sophisticated audience exposed to China, you really need to bring home the point that the overcapacity in housing is absolutely ubiquitous. It's actually obscene. You can't, and I've done things like, you know, drive down the highway and randomly get off at exits and go talking to the local districts and ask them how much housing they have on sale. I've been to cities, you know, the city of Yinchuan and Ningxia, where 60% of the population works for the state and has allocated housing. They had, the last time I visited about 18 months ago, they had 1.2 million units on the market ready for sale. That's not counting sold but idle housing. And the population of the city is something on the order of 1.2 million. This is, and you know, that's at the peak of the US market, I believe we sold 1.2 million new homes nationally. So this is the degree of excess right now in China. As I point out here, there are roughly 70 million units of new housing in the construction chain right now. Clearly, you can't bring all of those to completion. That's going to be very serious for the construction companies. So many might say, okay, this has happened before, so why is it serious now? And I think that the simple answer is that we've reached our debt limit now. And there are various ways of showing that. And the reason that I think that we've reached, the one critical reason that we've reached our debt limit in China is that you no longer have the free lunch of QE3 and sort of free, or you know, interest-free money circulating internationally that's attracted into China for the carry rates that are being offered in the property industry there. You don't have the same inflow of money, and therefore it's much more difficult to finance these things without simply printing fake money. So this is, I probably should have put this elsewhere, but this is simply to support my point about retail and the consumer. You do get, I don't know how to go backwards on this, but you do get statistics out of the NBS that consistently show 12 to sort of 11 to 13% growth every year, every month, every year over the last 20 or so in retail. But you need to take out of those statistics unsold inventories and government procurement, which includes construction materials, which is double counting. You do have series out of the government that are more, I believe, more reflective of reality. There's a unit which used to be part of the old Ministry of Internal Trade, which gives you a series. It's pretty, it shows much more fluctuation and volatility, but it certainly is very different from that provided by the NBS, and that shows you the comparison of the two only through the first half of last year. So this is the part about consumer companies on Shanghai Exchange. This is another thing that's important for the finance world, probably not so important for you, but it's the e-commerce world. This, you know, we've got a lot of information from Alibaba, JD.com, Vipshop, and so forth, because they've recently listed in the United States and have become, you know, are issuing a lot of information about the surging growth of these industries. My brief point of view on this industry is that it's banking. It's not sale of goods. There is sale of goods going over these networks. The sale of goods is rising. It's generally occurring at a negative gross margin. It will decline again, and it's investment driven, but the key motivation of these companies, Tencent, NetEase to the extent that it has it, Alibaba, JD.com, and so forth, is their ability to aggregate capital through the payment systems that they control, and the ability to move that capital into investment vehicles. And that's what's the core value of those companies, both to those companies and to the regulators, but it doesn't reflect an underlying growth in consumption. So, what's going to happen? I think that it's worth pausing for a moment to think about some of the social ramifications of this, of the property explosion and the property bust that's really been underway for the last year or so, since the Hangzhou decline of last February. You have a situation, you know, there's a great misunderstanding, I think, in the international world of what urbanization means. People here, you know, because we use this term to apply to developing countries around the world, we think of it as rural people moving to urban areas and becoming urban people. It's not at all what it is in China. Urbanization in China is urbanization in situ. It's a local government that owns rural land, that has incentives to change the bureaucratic designation of that land to urban through making the population denser, through a certain level of investment, through a number of other things. The local people have strong interest in becoming urban people because they get better access to schools, hospitals, and so forth. So there's a great confluence of interest in over-investing in rural land and building what essentially tend to be useless. I made it bigger again. Here are a couple of things from my cell phone. Again, an LED park that used to be an orange grove in Guangdong, totally deserted now, but absorbed well over $1 billion in capital investment. A logistics port in Taizhou, that's Zhejiang Taizhou or Jiangsu Taizhou, I forget. Jiangsu, Zhejiang has one too, right? Anyway, this one, I like this one because I was actually chased by a mob. Because I had a meeting with the local LGFE official who was in charge of developing this, and he was the one who cleared the people who had been growing citrus in this area and built this logistics port. It turns out there's absolutely no need for inland coal logistics. And they even built the docks to the wrong standards, so they couldn't get deep draft ships, and it's just a disaster. So the people had been paid, but because of the particular type of bureaucratic designation, they had to buy houses in the new district if they were to have houses. They were incensed. When I arrived to meet the guy, there were all these people running around yelling, but it was in Zhejianghua, it was in like Minanhua or something, not Minanhua, but some kind of Zhejiang dialect, and I couldn't follow it, so I wasn't paying attention. So, I call the official I'm supposed to meet, and he says, "I'm downstairs, come meet me by the elevator." So I go downstairs, the mob runs down the stairs, and I'm taking the elevator. I get down, and he's here, "Come over here." So I jog, and the mob follows us. We get in his car, slam the doors, and they throw themselves on the hood, and he drives off because they're looking for compensation. And this is a situation that you find all over the country. So you have, a country filled with these model cities, model shopping centers, and, logistics parks and things like that, which are really totally, unutilized and, changing the complexion of Chinese society. Let me just move on quickly to less of the disaster stuff. So why is it building to a crisis right now? I think that the simple reason is just because we've gotten to a point where so much credit is going to keep everything rolling over. Because of the concern of what will happen politically if this debt is recognized, following sort of the daisy chain of relatedness and of obligation, because there's so much. Because of the importance of the shadow sector, which until mid last year was about 55% of funding. Nobody really has a good grip on who owns all that debt. And so allowing debt instruments to go belly up can create this chain of consequences that any government would be terrified to identify or to be confronted with. And therefore, you keep everything rolling over. Right now, the amount of capital that's required to keep it rolling over has reached a dangerous level. We're putting about 1.2 trillion renminbi into the system every day just to keep the banks liquid. And that creates all sorts of opportunities for failure. As I think you know, the central government has faced capital flight now for the first time in a long time. We had a net reduction of $91 billion in reserves last year. There was a capital flight of about $150 billion in the second half. And this is, you would think, with 3.8 trillion, so they say, it would be not of such great concern. I think there are a couple of issues there. One issue is that many of those reserves are not so liquid. They're out in things like, debt to Venezuela, and so, it's of great concern to them. And also, it's accelerating, as you see from the pressure on the exchange rate. So this is a key break point. I think that the anti-corruption campaigns are something that we need to consider as part of this whole complex of economic issues. I think that the political system, fundamentally any political system's ultimate need is to provide its own network of critical supporters with resources. And when resources in society, the Jiang Zemin era created network capital at a phenomenal level and higher expectations of how much network capital would be available to the elite. So it became like Silicon Valley, well, Cheney's grandson made $1 billion, well, I'm way better than he is, why shouldn't I? So when you start growing at a lower rate and not having so many resources to provide to the network, what you need to do is aggregate their capital to your network. And I think that's the simple way that we should understand the anti-corruption event. So what's next? Is it going to be a sharp decline, interbank defaults, as we saw in 2013, and a quick devaluation? I expect there will be a devaluation. I don't know about the defaults. I think there will be further corruption attacks on the banks and brokerages, and particularly casinos and other channels, Qianhai District and Shenzhen, other channels for exiting money. And I think we'll see a continued closing of the country to foreign influences. So this is basically the range of the debate now. Does it go out with a bang or with a whimper? Do we see continued long deflationary bust with no growth or negative growth until slowly you start to fill up that capacity and write it off? Or do we see a bust? So that's about it.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. That's good. Bob, I think we're going to have you chime in.
Okay. Given that, I'd like to say something optimistic. So I'll sort of try. And Anne's work is always really interesting and provocative. When I was in China, I was always really impressed by her and her colleagues' ability to go out into the field and see things, because China is so difficult to understand, and if you get around, at least you have a better shot at it, but it's such a diverse place. But okay, so here's some critiques of what Anne said. So to start off, Anne was talking about GDP to debt ratio between 200 and 300%. That's a hell of a range. 200%, which is, I think, basically the generally accepted view of what the GDP to debt ratio is. To get another 100%, just to throw it on there, I mean, it added 9 percentage points last year. So that's 10 more years before you get to 300%. I also think that Anne's presentation was heavily dependent on the sort of SOE view of the economy. That's a a portion of the economy, an incredibly important portion, but we have Nick Lardy in the front row, who's written extensively on sort of the diminishing importance of the SOE. A lot of the presentation also is a critique, which everybody who's in China looks at China criticizes the government stats. I mean, I don't believe they're growing at 7.4% either, but it's so easy to cherry pick. Okay, so we don't believe 7.4%. But how come we do believe the cement stats, or we believe the steel stats, or whatever? You know, all of the stats that we depend on are produced by the government. So how come we depend on some, but we don't depend on others? And how come the ones that we depend on are the ones that make things look really bad? I think the chances that China is growing negative are astonishingly small. I mean, I think if China was really not growing at 7.4%, but at negative, I think you'd have huge unemployment that would be impossible to hide. The only time that the unemployment of all the stats, the unemployment stats are the worst. I mean, it's 4.1% unemployment every quarter, even during the global recession. But during the global recession, you saw millions of people going back from Shenzhen. You could go to, I mean, I wasn't there, but people who were there tell me you can go to train stations and see, you know, people lining up. You don't see that. There are people going back. It's certainly true. There are people going back to their home provinces, and that's, I think, you know, probably mostly because there's a little more opportunity there. But if you're in Shenzhen or Guangzhou, the problem is not that they have too many workers. It's the opposite still. So how does that square? So I think I do agree. I mean, the way I look at it is 7.4, whatever the number is, this is China as it is. I totally agree with Ann's way of looking at things, of looking at corporations whose stats whose reporting you believe to be more accurate because they're under SEC mandates or whatever. And so this is China as it is. Things are clearly slowing. There's no reason to think that McDonald's or P&G have all of a sudden lost out in a fight with whatever the local, the Chinese company is. And you know, their sales are flat. So I mean, something clearly is slowing substantially. And I think also the usual answer for all this, I think the government's usual answer for all this is, you know, we recognize there's problems, we're going to reform, we're going to change the sort of basis of the way the society, the way the economy operates. I think there's precious little evidence that that has occurred so far. I think slower growth, slower official growth is not evidence of reform. It's just evidence of things slowing. What was I thinking of? Oh, and that the, I think one thing that Anne pointed to a little bit, I think has actually a bigger negative effect. I think the anti-corruption drive is vastly underrated in terms of how much it's slowing the economy. I think what's happening, I don't know how to show it in the stats, is some story I never got to, but the idea, I mean, the positive way of looking at the anti-corruption drive is that, you know, she is taking on very powerful interests, and many of them are at the SOEs, and so when he finally turns to SOE reform, who in the world is ever going to oppose him? Possible, it'll happen. But the negative, which I think is the case, is that he's scared people to death, and that bureaucrats are just afraid to approve projects because they either might be on the take or could be accused of being on the take, and that it's added to a sort of general ennui among sort of the government and business class, and it's hard to see how they end it. And I assume that that it surprised them too. It being the depth of the corruption has surprised the officials that got into it. I don't think they thought it would be this deep and take that much time. So let me just sort of end by the way I mean, I agree also that you know, that there is certainly a debt squeeze of some proportion here, and that the numbers don't work out. They just don't work out. The way I don't see why this year or next year it should be any different than 3 years ago. I think government has vast resources. I don't see why they can't keep the system operating pretty much the way it's been operating. In terms of keeping companies from going bankrupt and you know, printing money or however they need to get the money to keep the system operating. But I think what we're seeing is sort of the way I think about it is sort of sand in the gears. The things are slowing, and they're slowing more, and they're slowing faster than the government either acknowledges or expects. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you.
Scott, can I have the keyboard?
Yep.
Sure. Super. I think what I'll do is thank you. Right. Put that guy there. Terrific. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. And I was kind of an instigator to try and put this panel together because there's just been this long-term debate about China's economic and political trajectory. And the debate doesn't only occur when China's growing fast, it also occurs when it's growing slow. And there's been long-term discussion, you know, is this sustainable? And instead of having greater consensus, we get a hardening positions over the years, even though in some ways over the very short term, about, you know, what's going to happen this year, the range of predictions has been relatively narrow. I've just put up some of the estimates that these various organizations have made either in December or January. And they're not hugely far apart. But of course, Anne is one of the people I respect most who follows China. I've known her for 20 plus years now. And when she was at the U.S.-China Business Council, she was actually the editor of the first article I ever published, which was on the Stone Group, which has declined precipitously and will never recover.
It was a great article.
Yeah. So it's been all downhill since, for me and Stone, I guess. But you know, I've always, and you know, and in talking to Anne over the years, you know, she's one of the most keen observers. She is the one who goes out to the provinces, to the towns, who stays in the horrible hotels, who gets chased by mobs. And so you have to take that seriously, extremely seriously. And she's been very successful in her career, and so there's a good record there. And so, but a lot of times I find when I talk to folks who have a different take, it seems like there's some type of people talking past each other every so often. And so to some extent it's like Chinese crosstalk, where you never get a debate resolved. But I always thought, I wanted it to be more like pro wrestling. I was thinking I would love to have an event which is sort of a optimist, pessimist China smackdown. But you know, Anne's probably not a great wrestler, and Bob, I wouldn't want to force him to wrestle either. But I do want to wrestle over the issues, and you know, I don't have a specific point of view on this, but you know, how are we in the midst of a hard landing? Is this is the economy going to crash and burn? But what I thought I would do is say a little bit about what I think the sources of the disagreement are. And to some extent, it's posing a question to both Anne and Bob, but it's also highlighting that there is this big debate that still exists. And here I've listed what I think are the key differences of opinion or sources of the debate. And the first, you know, I don't want to go into a scholarly exercise based on my experience at Indiana University for 14 plus years. You all don't need that. But there is differences of opinion about the role of the state and development. And those who tend to be more pessimistic about China tend to think that the state's role needs to be quite limited and narrow, and that government intervention usually leads to misappropriation of resources. And they tend to look down on IP theft, pollution, a closed media, a lack of democracy. And there's another school of thought that looks at development that says states in the development process need to intervene. And they're not so concerned about corruption and IP theft and pollution, that these are all things which are part of actually fostering development in many countries, and that once you develop, these are things which aren't, that you don't want to continue. The other area where there's a big intellectual divide is the type of data. And this is a more important point, and we heard about this from the presentation. Those who take a more negative or dour look at the economy and its future possibilities are very skeptical of most macro data, and they take a micro view look of China. They travel and look for what tangible things they can put their hands around, and particularly focus on those physical measures. These are the things which Tom Rowski in the late 90s pointed out in 1998 that he thought China was in a recession because he looked at these things. Made the Chinese government very unhappy with him, but these are the things which are now part of the Li Keqiang index as well. So I guess they apologized without apologizing, or appropriated. Another IP theft that, I don't know if Tom is going to file a suit on that, but he might. On the other hand, there are those who prefer a macro view because looking at these specific measures or going to specific towns seems too anecdotal. And so turning off the highway randomly may provide you some insight, but those who take a macro view would want a more systematic. They'd say, choose 10 highways to turn off, and maybe you've done that. But the folks that look at the macro data view think that you need some systematic way to look at data, and you're trying to look at trends over time, and that the incentive for the government, if it is to be biased, ought to be consistently biased rather than randomly biased, and therefore these trends are more important than the absolute numbers. And so these intellectual differences translate into substantive disagreements. In terms of the size of the economy, Anne has talked about how overstated it is due to the inventory buildup and deals which are based on patronage networks and the overstatement of consumption. On the other side, the folks who are more optimistic, or at least cautiously optimistic, have been pointing to the efforts by the National Bureau of Statistics, who have gone back and redone the numbers and think the economy is actually larger than they originally estimated, and put forth a whole new range of data. I know Dan Rosen at the Rhodium Group has also done his own looking and is coming out with figures that aren't as large a change from the NBS numbers. I think actually he's going to be presenting here some of those findings in a few weeks. In terms of the questions about debt, I guess the most negative view is that essentially what we have is a pyramid scheme economy, that debt is just being rolled over and pushed out the door and growing just to keep the whole system on life support. And of course, and Bob talked about the other perspective. It does depend on how high you say it is, and that one person's pyramid scheme is another person's financial deepening. Essentially, that you develop new types of products, and China doesn't have a very deep financial system now. So developing more products, I guess it all turns on, do you think that these debts will eventually go bad, or they will have some productive use in the future? And China's economic model has been build it and they will come. And then the question is, will they build it and eventually come? And Anne's view, they may eventually come, but it will be too late for them to come and to use these things. The debt numbers, I've got a couple things here on debt that come from, I think they're partly the study that Anne cites. They round off, this is from McKinsey, the Global Institute. Their report that just came out puts debt to GDP at 282%. She just rounded up 2.8 to 300 or so. And you can see that, yes, China's debt is very high, but there are other countries that are not in crisis who also have quite high debt. I'll go to another table that they have in the report, China ranks 22nd in this report in terms of total debt to GDP ratio, a slightly different type of calculation that they made. But 300% could be manageable if the United States and others can continue to grow. I think the calculation that you would need 18 to 20% annual growth to deal with the debt must assume that the economy actually isn't growing. Because as long as the economy grows, that denominator is going to expand, so that absolute debt number, as long as the debt doesn't grow as fast as the economy, should shrink as a proportion of the economy and therefore make it serviceable. And then if you have financial deepening, you can spread it out. You can roll over the loans or turn them into bonds, recapitalize banks. There's a lot of ways. There's still a lot of places to put these funds. In the late 1990s, they were worried about the banks. And they recapitalized the banks, created the asset management companies, and that dealt with that. So I'm not trying to say that this isn't my view, but there is that view. I don't think that these folks who have this position are necessarily Pollyannish. Let me just go back here. I think another issue that hasn't been discussed as much is to what extent is Bob hinted at it a little bit, but to what extent is the slowdown now simply a structural slowdown where we're heading in one direction because of these real structural problems that are holding the economy back and pushing it in one direction, and to what extent is this cyclical? And I think to some extent those who take a more sanguine view would say that there's some cyclical elements to this, maybe Chinese-style austerity. The anti-corruption measures in some ways are a austerity measure that if you relax them or have people adapt their behavior to them, you will then see a revival of growth. They will then be able to make the investments and choices with less danger. In addition, you've got global slowdown, global commodity prices dropping, which for some aren't a product of China's slowdown, but just as a glut of the producers in iron ore. You've got the iron ore providers trying to run the Chinese iron ore providers out of business, so they're just producing to try and bring the price down to put the Chinese out of business. The Chinese haven't been out of business. So that's part of the slowdown, is potentially part of the reason we have slow growth now. In terms of growth potential, that wasn't, I think the pessimists don't see a lot of chance for future growth because of the debt overhang, the lack of innovation amongst Chinese companies. Those who have a more positive view see lots of places where China can grow. And the idea that China has already picked all the low-hanging fruit on growth, these people would say, no, there's still a lot of things. You still have urbanization, the movement of people off farms into cities, irrespective of whether it's to fulfill some government priorities but there's still a lot of folks in agriculture who could work, and your productivity, labor productivity, immediately goes up when you do that, as well as when you move into services. Hukou reform, which the Chinese are in the midst of implementing, ought to lead to also greater improvement in allocation of labor resources. China's retirement age is now still relatively low, 60 for men, 55 or 50 for women, depending on where they work. You can just simply up the retirement ages, and you've got more people in the labor pool. Reforms to the energy prices, competition, allowing more private companies into sectors dominated by SOEs. These are all relatively straightforward policies or trends that could be adopted, which could still generate growth for a pretty significant amount of time. And then the last issue has to do with the seriousness of the reform efforts. And it seems to me that there's still this debate, and it's partly because China's politics is so opaque and hard to read, that is Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, are they doing this just to protect their patronage network and keep themselves in power? Or do they have serious policy goals? And that the limits of implementation so far are a result of those vested interests that they haven't been able to overcome yet. And so they're trying to do so many things at one time that really what we need to look at as a 10-year reform program instead of measuring it after just the first 3 years. So I think those are the areas where there's debate and differences that divide these camps. And it's not really, again, it's not clear to determine who's right. you know, pro wrestlers aren't aeronautical engineers. And when you build a plane and you put it up in the sky, if it doesn't work, it's going to crash, right? Economists or people that write about the economy, we don't have that problem. We don't usually say go long on China, go short on China. Usually our analysis, and particularly with the people that we deal directly with, are about a specific sector, specific part of the country, a very narrow range of time, or the currency. And there you can apply a whole variety of different types of analyses and come up with very smart and wise investment choices that say there's going to be problems here, that's how you should invest, or there's going to be growth in this area. And people offering those different advice at the same time are both right. The evidence shows both their planes all fly, even though they're flying according to different approaches in engineering. So I think it's a hard debate. I think my job has been to say that we don't know. At least there's not consensus. And maybe the question is, and I guess if I was going to leave with one question, it would be, what would it take, what type of evidence would you need to see, and so that your picture of the economy and the trajectory would change? And then what would be the most negative type of things? Would you have to see a financial crisis, Bob, before you would admit that there isn't potential in the economy? So I think trying to, the best social science or best analysis always tries to identify, under what situation would I be proven wrong? And so why don't I stop there, and we can have more discussion.
Thanks, Scott. I'd like to give Anne a chance to respond to both sets of comments and maybe answer that question. And then maybe Bob, you can answer that one too.
Let me give a quick response before we start talking with everybody. One thing, I'm really a stranger or a guest in the world of finance, but it's that's my clientele, so that's something that I study and try to get better at all the time. And there is one thing that I really like about finance, which is you're right or you're wrong. It's not a moral issue whether Tencent is a growing company, its share price is going to rise, and Baidu's is going to fall. It's not an ethical issue whether you like this model or that. You're right or you're wrong. And there are issues on which I've been right and issues on which I've been wrong in that world. And I think that we've progressed in China beyond the point where analysis of the economy is a matter of whether you have an intellectual framework that says I'm for the government or against it, or I'm a China lover or China hater. I don't feel that I fit into a camp there at all. Of course I have my own prejudices, but you could kind of push them this way or that way. And I think that the characterization of of our economic in my company, the processes that we go through is perhaps a little bit too abstract. So let me stop at that. Let me pause at that issue for a moment. For example, as to Bob's point, how do you decide which statistics to accept and which not to? You take the pessimistic ones, you don't take. Not at all. Not at all. I take the statistics that are most important to driving the economy. So steel is incredibly important. Cement is very important. Property is very important. Certain small things like the production of routers is not so important, so I don't pay so much attention to that. On steel, we have our own survey, our own proprietary survey that covers 35% of the production in the country. We conduct it every month. We pay the respondents, and we aggregate the results. We triangulate that against the CISA data. We purchase MySteel data, which provides you with a mill-by-mill output number, and we interview mills, of course, all the time. We check inventory at port. We look at import and export data. We have a very, very extensive data set on steel. And when I say that domestic demand fell by 4.8%, that's not because I'm just quoting a negative statistic. It happens that this last year, CISA came around finally and started to report a negative number. They came out at 0 for the year because exports tripled, but domestically, they reported a down number. Now, that wasn't true through most of the year, but the way that they were doing it, by the way, was to change the base. So, so they give a month-by-month total of steel production, and then they give a year-to-date total, and the month-by-month total and the year-to-date totals didn't add. So I can explain how that happens, but that was basically how they did it. NBS steel is higher for reasons that I could explain if you really want to be bored with the topic. But these are not casual judgments. Now, I don't claim to be able to recreate China's GDP set, but it's not like I'm just cherry-picking statistics. So that's, perhaps I overstress that point. As for the 300 versus 200%, I revised the presentation to give you the more conservative number that is simply calculated from the NBS data, or actually the PBOC data. I have my own number, which is around 300%, and that's based on a calculation of debt held by different institutions. But that's a more difficult thing to use if you want to clear out the double counting. But I'm not simply adding 100% because I want to. So, and it's informed by constantly talking to banks. So the distress that I'm discussing reflects the distress that I hear from the economy all the time. So when I was walking around in 2010 and 2009, I would be sort of irritated and frustrated maybe by hearing all the banks talk about what a fantastic investment this new zone was, when clearly there was no real demand for it. But that was the case of the situation, that was the situation, and I reported it, and it was a positive point of view. In 2011, things changed very dramatically, and I don't think you can find a bank, a developer, an e-commerce vendor, a private company or a public company in China that is positive about its future, except in banking. Not in banking, but in shadow banking, which is an important asterisk, and it doesn't reflect something very positive about the long-term economy. And as for the final point about private versus public, I would like to have that discussion with you. My personal view is that the Chinese reforms of the 1990s discovered one of the very important events, or emanations from those events, was a way to make equity ownership unimportant in the economy, in order to create institutions that would be able to operate in a more independent way, to create more value, and yet create beneficial cash flows for the state. I would submit to you that no organization gets above $10 million in gross revenues in China without having very important and ultimately very limiting backward links into the state. And I don't really care who technically owns what. I could tell you in some detail who's going to get cash out of the maturation of shares in Alibaba in March, and it doesn't have much to do with who actually owns it. So perhaps I'm being too vehement, but I was like, what? You don't understand? I'm not just driving off roads. So anyway, maybe we should go to the audience.
Bob, did you want to?
I think the question to me was, what would it take for me to think things are really, really bad? Is that basically it? Unemployment, basically. People out of work, people going home, wages going down, that sort of thing. I mean, I think ultimately, even in this country, we tend to focus too much on the numbers and not on the sort of standard of living, which is, after all, the point of economic, point of the economy. And so I guess that's what I'd be looking for. I think, by the way, driving off the road is a great idea. I mean, when I was trying to do, and I talked to Ann about this story, when I was trying to do a story before the numbers made it clear that the housing was heading downward. So all the numbers were basically positive. And then you say to yourself, well, the numbers are positive, whether you believe the numbers or not. And some of those numbers were from private sources. And then you say to yourself, well, if I'm a Chinese reporter and I go to Detroit and I say, well, I'm writing about America, it's part of America, but I mean, you wouldn't get a representative view. And China is so much more complicated and so much more diverse. But for me, I mean, this is Ann and I are in the same ballpark, basically. to me, it was that every single city I went to, for whatever reason, every single one was surrounded by empty apartment buildings. It was astonishing. And then at some point you say to yourself, you know, the anecdotal is more important than the statistical. And so it's a problem in reporting in China.
Great, thanks. All right, well, you've all been very patient, so I think we'll open it up to the audience. Per standard CSIS procedure, please identify yourself and do confine your question to a question rather than a soliloquy, and wait for the microphone to arrive. Right over here.
Thanks. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. I'd like to have the panelists explore more of the political ramifications of what clearly is a slowdown. There's been a suggestion that unemployment is the key thing to watch. For many, many years, the conventional wisdom has been that the political legitimacy of the communist leadership depends on two things: nationalism and rapid economic growth. Clearly, we're not getting rapid economic growth anymore. When does this change begin to affect the government's ability to keep control politically?
Anyone?
I mean, it's not my specialty. It's much more yours. But my view is that the idea that that social instability is an issue in Chinese politics is much overstated. I think that if ultimately that there's a political event in China, and even the collapse of the Communist Party, it comes from the bureaucracy. It comes from within, from the people who have the ability to organize and the incentive to do so, and the ability to create a structure to replace what they displace. I think that the idea of, you know, the legitimacy resting on economic, I think that's a little too filmy for people to really, you know, I do think that what's going on now does not have, it clearly doesn't have anything to do, I mean, it has something to do. It has very little to do with corruption. If the focus were on eradicating corruption, clearly the response would be legal reform and structural reform. That's never been on the table. It's never been of interest. I think the fact, the attacks on Minsheng Bank, Haitong Securities, Beijing Bank, Founder Securities, now possibly Unicom, and so on and so forth, these indicate that, that it's become so important to capture resources. That's my view of the core value of this, is capturing resources. I know that's controversial, but if that's become so important that the political system is willing to jettison a lot of international faith and that provides portfolio capital. And that's a warning sign. And I do think that things are getting much worse.
I would simply add that you know, I think some years ago there was a iron rule that if growth fell below 8%, there would be, you know, massive chaos. Didn't happen. And now below 7% most likely, and hasn't happened. I mean, one thing that is interesting is the government's own emphasis on employment. When you think about the demographic and structural changes that are happening, you would think they would be less concerned about this over time, right? In fact, if they were so worried about it, why aren't they building more shoe factories and, you know, things like that, right, to employ a lot of people? So my sense is this is part and parcel of the broader debate. You know, Xi Jinping has announced that there is a new normal in the economy. I think consistent with some of the things Anne's been saying, my perception is that now the real fight among those that matter in the system is how do we define what the new normal is, because that will help separate the winners and losers out of what comes next. Next, right here up in the front. So I think just 1 second.
Thank you. My name is Haibing. Now I'm visiting scholars in the CSIS. I have two questions. The first is about risk. I do agree with the panelist analysis on the China's economy performance. And no matter it's negative or positive, this is the reality of the China's economy. So from your observations, what looks likely the biggest risk for the China's economy in the 2015? My second question is about the new measures of the reform and opening. As we know that in the 2015, China is planning for our 13 5-year plan. So it is a very critical year. Now the President Xi mentioned, put forward the idea of the new Silk Road strategy and also Shanghai Pilot Free Trade Zone reform. So from your observations, if like you give suggestion to the China's government, what do you think China should do, must do in the following 5 years in the opening and reforming measures? Thank you.
Go right ahead, Scott.
Okay, all right. I think, I think, as much as there's a difference of opinion from the different observers, I think most would agree that the debt problem is the most risky problem. And that if there are enough defaults or folks want their money out of multiple banks all at the same time, or there's problems using the foreign exchange reserves to deal with problems or print money, that, and since crises are as much psychological as material, that there's not a 100% guarantee that the government could keep it in the box, and that there is a possibility of a crisis. I think given the government's toolkit, the relatively very small percentage of debt that is foreign, the low fiscal deficit that the government has, its ability simply to shut the bank's doors, that I think that's a very low probability. But it's still possible, and it's the one that probably keeps folks in the PBOC and elsewhere in Zhongnanhai most concerned.
I have a couple. So the way I sort of think about this is things that are beyond the ability of the government to control. And so one is the housing problems. Have they gotten to the point where people think housing is a really terrible investment and that they aren't going to buy housing? And that, I mean, you saw that's what happened here, and it sort of ricocheted through the economy. It's a different economy, it's a different structure, but once people's attitudes change, it's really hard to get them to change back, and it can take quite some time. Another thing is, at some point, presumably, they're going to let something significant go broke, and they will try that as a test case, to see, to try to warn people that not everything's guaranteed, and that can go really quite badly. It's kind of the equivalent of the Fed raising interest rates when it should be lowering it, and sort of creating a recession. And then the third, and this is kind of overreaction, so the capital outflows. Do the leaders basically freak out? I mean, let's say they do have 3.8 trillion and they lose 200 billion or whatever it is, not that much, but they really get nervous because the way in which the reserves are viewed is as a national it's silly, but it's sort of a national treasure as opposed to something you use. And so if that were to happen, will they pull back enormously on any sort of efforts to open the economy or further open the economy or reform?
Me? Look, I'm a structure person, not a person. I believe that what the Chinese government does or doesn't do is not very relevant, and I think the idea that spending money to drive exports to Central Asia, and by the way, getting all these strategic benefits out of it, I think it just is irrelevant. Essentially, it's irrelevant to the economy generally. You can think of lots of relevance for particular companies and for particular strategic goals, but fundamentally, and I also feel that we have many years of training in thinking that there's a concurrence between what the Chinese government says and what happens. And this is largely because of the control of information, which has been very, very, very successful. I think we need to recognize that the Chinese government, it's actually quite an antiquated ruling structure or system, political system. Their ability to achieve goals is very limited. And one of the principal goal that the Chinese government is able to achieve economically is investment. That's it. there are no other goals. If you can think through, rebalancing or, or environment or, whatever other goals have been articulated, the internationalization of the renminbi, the other goals that have been articulated over the decades, nothing that's not accomplished with capital investment has ever been achieved, because those are the measures that they have to hand. And the problem with the economy right now is that capital investment is not the answer. So I believe that the central government, there are political things that can go very wrong. There are ways to manage the monetary system that can be mistakes. But I think the idea that they pull this lever to try to slow things down and pull that lever to speed things up is simply the wrong optic. I think actually their hands are more and more tied, and there's not very much that they can do. As for the key risk to the economy, it's bank failure.
Okay. Right here in the front.
Bob Vastine, Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Dr. Kennedy, you mentioned services, and I'm aware, having spent some time in the services sector, that Chinese leadership has, over this past several years, very grandly announced that they were going to shift the proportion of the economy from about 40% services to something a good deal higher. The Chinese have underperformed the rest of the world on creating services jobs and building their services sector. And Dr. Yang, you just said governments can't do anything about it. But I'm wondering if there has been any progress over the last year or two since major announcements were made on increasing the economic activity in the services sector, jobs, and thus bringing more stability.
I guess one of the first points when I brought up services, and this gets to a point that Anne raised, and the type of data is a lot of the physical measures are the ones that she works very hard to measure and that others look at apply to the industrial economy. And over a longer period of time, services has become a growing share of the economy. And so we'll need other types of measures to see whether there's slowdowns in that are equal to the industry side. And services have continued to grow. Private sector has continued to grow. And I would expect to see continued gradual improvement. I would agree with Anne that you can't, in one policy swoop, change the radical course. But there have been, they've talked about liberalizing education to allow more private schools, health care to have more private hospitals, and other types of liberalization in financial services. And those are policy measures which they have taken small steps on, which they could take much larger steps on. My own expectation is to continue to see that the services as a proportion of the overall economy continue to grow. And as long as there isn't the financial crisis that's generated by bank failure, to not see, to continue to see that as progress in the economy. Whether, it's comparing the structure of the Chinese economy to the structure of the American economy or most European economies really doesn't make sense, given that their per capita GDP is $6,000 per year and ours is $40,000 to $50,000 per year. And of course, we're going to have much greater services as a proportion of our economy. But the trend is relatively clear. So I don't see anything which should suggest that we're going to move back towards greater industry or agriculture as a part of the economy.
Anything to add? No, you're good? Okay. Matt Goodman.
Matthew Goodman here at CSIS. I can trump Scott because I've actually known Ann Stevenson for 40 years, since we were in high school, and this is the first time we've seen each other in 40 years. So good to see you, Ann.
Cool.
That's right. So it seems to me a lot of people have gone broke predicting that China was going to collapse over the last 35 years. So it seems to me the burden of proof is on people who say who think it's declining or there's a problem, to show what's changed and what's different. And one thing is that by their own assertion, they have to move, and you've just suggested again, Anne, they have to move from an investment-led model of growth to one based more on consumption, domestic, and other forms of domestic demand. And that seems to me means that they have to have better resource allocation and a financial system that is more geared towards that model, which means they have to have financial liberalization, including interest rate deregulation and all the other things that come along with deeper liquid capital markets, more open capital accounts. And all of that seems to me is likely to raise the interest rate structure in the economy, and that seems to me poses a huge risk. So I wondered if people could comment on that and how they manage that transition. The other thing is more of a political economy question, which is that the system to date and the old model was all based on one objective, growth, and everybody was lined up behind that objective, and all the incentives were directed towards that objective. And now you have multiple objectives because people want some growth and rising incomes, but they also want clean air, they want clean government, they want their trash taken out, they want all kinds of things that people want in a more pluralized system. So the question is, how do you incentivize the people, the actors, the local officials, the local state-owned enterprise officials to pursue these multiple objectives in a way that keeps growth moving forward but addresses all these other concerns?
Fantastic questions. You want me to take the first,
Sure.
first hit there, because there's a lot to say about them. But I would say, as to the first question, you're absolutely right. Everybody talked about the exciting new bank liberalization that would ensue back when Xi Jinping's government took over in early 2012 or in late 2012. It was clear, as many of us so-called pessimists were saying, it was clear that there was only one direction for interest rates, which is down, and that has occurred. And until you deal with the elephant in the room, which is the debt, you can't have bank liberalization because the banks are, there's a fiction that the banks are actually solvent because you have this massive, massive load of stuff that has to be constantly rolled over. So that's the problem. And there's a lot of debate over what could happen if they went through a 2002 event, 98 to 2002 event again, whether that's possible. I would be pessimistic about that, but at any rate, that has to happen before the banks can liberalize. As to, what was the second part? I forgot.
Incentives.
Incentives.
Yeah, how do you
right,
realign incentives
in the system.
away from growth?
There are a lot of answers to that. I think the simplest is the political, because as you all are aware here, the key structural event post-1989 was a restructuring of the relationship among the 5 levels of government, very specifically and deliberately undertaken in order to strengthen the central government's ability to hold the country together, knowing that there was a significant cost. And there was a significant cost to the economy and to the culture and to the future of China, but that was a cost that was willingly undertaken because of the concern that China would fragment. Now we're in a situation where local governments are responsible for the great majority of costs and for social services and have no ability to raise their own budgets and taxes. So that's why we have the land issue. It's why it's one of the 3 key reasons why we had the housing expansion in 2006, and you can't get away from that unless you give local governments unless you collapse the 5 levels of government to maybe 3, and you give the local governments the ability to raise capital. That weakens the center, and that's clearly not on the table.
Or Scott?
To me, on the second issue, so the multiple objectives, I think there are sort of 2 ways around it. One, which they're trying, telling officials that they'll be judged on multiple objectives. And it's not just growth that will get you a promotion. Doesn't seem to be doing very much at the moment, but that's what they're trying to do, to give them a scale of things to be judged on. But GDP, whether you believe the numbers or not, GDP at least is a number. How do you, I mean, if you're in Hebei surrounding Beijing, I mean, how do you legitimately say to them, your pollution readings have to go down? It's not exactly under your control very much. The other one is step back, I mean, privatize. These are the state-owned companies. They have two masters, right? They have a political master and then they have a corporate master. Well, remove the political master as much as you possibly can. They do talk about that, but again, that's would be quite a leap.
I agree. Focusing on growth is obviously a much more simpler goal when you just have that one target. I'm not a big believer in modernization theory per se, but I do think in the time that I've been going to China and interacting with Chinese since the 80s, that I have seen value changes in Chinese, in what they think is important overall. And obviously making incomes and originally wanting to have a refrigerator and a bicycle and an apartment and over time and wanting to have more material wealth is changed. But Chinese are also interested in a lot of other things. A cleaner environment, quality education for their families. And I think that these things gradually work their way up and through the system. They're parts of the discussions in the media. China doesn't have a powerful civil society, but does have a civil society and nonprofit groups, many of which are genuine grassroots organizations that promote these type of values. And that you see that in the surveys that are done by groups in China like Horizon and others. And although this isn't a government which is directly accountable through votes to people, they do pay attention to these polls, and the Communist Party itself does a lot of surveys. And I was really struck by the greater attention over the last couple years to air pollution. And that was not something that the Chinese central government wanted there to be a focus on. That was a product of popular views, individually and through groups, and partly the U.S. Embassy using its control of its sovereign territory on the Asian continent to have this measure, which everyone could read. But that has now become a high priority for the Chinese government. And I don't like to see China as a snapshot in time. I like to see it as a moving picture. And we are in the midst of this movie that's being made. And so obviously the air quality index looks horrible now. Pittsburgh's air quality used to look horrible. And if you go to Pittsburgh now, I wouldn't because it's too cold. But if I did, the air is much better. So I think as we watch this movie unfold, it is more complicated to have more diverse targets. To some extent, and that will be hard for this political system to implement. But you also have other sources of ideas and activity, which I think is gradually turning this ship.
Okay. Well, we're just about at time, so I appreciate everyone joining me and thanking the panel, and thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Right now. If you look at the simplest metrics, even for last year, leaving aside this quarter, and you always sort of drop into a data hole in the first quarter because of Spring Festival. But even looking at last year, we had domestic steel demand down by about 5%. We had, depending on how you read the statistics, but our point of view is that cement demand dropped by about 1 to 2%. It went negative last August. Freight and electric power appeared to go negative in May and not really recover. There were, basically all the industrial economy started to gear down and go tip negative around about May last year. It's very hard to come out to, the financial services industry grew I would argue that the consumer industry did not grow, but that's a very controversial point of view. Whichever way you calculate, you come to a very low level of growth, definitely negative in the current quarter. So, whoops, I seem to have lost, there we go. So we have a situation now where we have a very kind of depressed economy, not in the technical sense, but a kind of low depressed economy, and we have massive overcapacity in industry. So, for example, petrochemicals is an industry that I looked at pretty carefully a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, it was already running at about 65% capacity. Construction machinery is one that I know fairly well. That was running at 50% production capacity about a year ago. Steel is at around, it's gone from 85 to about 65, 70. So in major portions of the economy, cement also is certainly under 80%. Major portions of the economy, you have massive overcapacity. Clearly, it will take years of growth to fill up that capacity. So you have on one hand, and these are just exemplars of those issues. You have massive overcapacity, declining and probably negative growth. And so more and more difficulty filling up that capacity, adding to this phenomenon of very low loan demand and very sort of low demand in the economy. Aluminum is a case that I just thought I'd lay out for you because you have this contrast between the need of the governments to create growth through production targets and the actual demand in the economy. So one sort of aside comment that I might.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the snow, or the cold, to join us today. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here, and we're really glad to have you all here for what we hope will be a very interesting and engaging discussion on how to think about China's economy and what's happening. Just back from China myself, and certainly my impression was that a lot more pessimism with regard to where the economy is and its prospects. People becoming concerned that the traditional tools that the regime uses to keep the economy going aren't having the intended effects, and so on. And then just some real concerns that a lot of the numbers are looking very negative and not looking to turn around anytime soon. So we have a very distinguished panel with us today. Ann Stevenson Young, who co-founded J Capital Research in late 2007 and is the firm's research director. Her cover areas include solar, internet, medical devices, property, some consumer and direct sales, and China's macroeconomy. Ann was formerly co-founder of a group of online media businesses called Blue Bamboo Ventures, and also founded and operated a CRM software company. Clarity Data Systems, and a publishing company whose flagship magazine is City Weekend. Over 25 years in China, Ann has also worked as an industry analyst and trade advocate, heading the U.S. Information Technology Office, and 1993 to 97, the China operations of the U.S.-China Business Council, so obviously deep expertise. Bob Davis is a senior editor of the Wall Street Journal, who economic and other issues in the 2016 presidential campaign. From 2011 to 2014, he covered the Chinese economy from Beijing and still misses China despite the pollution. He and his wife, Deborah Bruno, are writing a book on their experiences in the country, which will be published by the Journal. Until October 2011, he was international economics correspondent in Washington, D.C., and from 2004 to 2011, he was the Journal's Latin America bureau chief. And then from 2002 to 2004, he was the Washington, D.C. news editor responsible for coverage of economic policy making. And then Scott Kennedy, deputy director here in the Freeman Chair and the head of our new program on Chinese business and political economy at CSIS. Scott is a leading authority on China's economic policy and its global economic relations. Specific areas of focus for Scott include industrial policy, business lobbying, multinational business challenges in China, Chinese participation in global economic regimes, and philanthropy. And for over 14 years before joining us here at CSIS, Scott was a professor at Indiana University, and prior to was director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business, and he was founding academic director of IU's China office. So with that, I think, Ann, we're going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Really, I'm first.
Yep. And
I'm not
we'll
sure
go
I'm
from
ready
there.
for that. Because I'm sure to some of you, the idea that China is growing negatively is very shocking, and you don't agree with that. But I would submit that the GDP number out of China is not a calculated result of data, but instead a production target. And I think that most in the central government would agree with that point of view. The production target is provided because the principal owner of state industry, SASAC, is the approver of all budgets for state enterprises, and budgets are made according to a very rigid formula, which is essentially GDP growth times this particular industry's historical proportion of GDP growth, or growth against GDP. X times Y equals Z, that's your target for the year. So if the government were to say, actually, GDP grew at 3% last year, and I think it'll grow at 1.8% this year, that sends a signal throughout state industry that your production target is now, if you're steel and you've traditionally grown at 1 point above GDP, then it would be 2.8. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can't do that. So the consumer sector I can spend time on if anybody cares about it, but I believe that the consumer sector actually is tracking close to zero as well. The number out of the NBS is the worst number that we have. What we do more commonly is just look at all the results on the A-share exchange. You have about, I don't know, 160 or so companies in consumer industries that are listed there. If you simply aggregate all of their revenue, you clear out the companies that didn't exist last quarter or do exist this quarter or disappeared this quarter, whatever, you come to negative growth in gross revenue of 2% at mid-year last year, of 6% in the third quarter. And that's not even clearing out investment-driven growth and acquisitions and mergers. So I think it's pretty clear that if the strongest consumer companies in China are seeing a decline in gross revenue, then the consumer industry is not in good shape. Am I going too slow?
No.
Okay.
I think you're on target.
All right. So as we all know, property is somewhere on the order of 20% of the economy, depending on which portions of property you count. And property has been tracking negative for some time. Sales of property are negative. Prices of property, hard to say. Right now, the indices that are provided are negative on pricing. And construction completions last year went up, and the amount of property in the chain went up because there's a huge there's a pipe of loans from the banks, outstanding loans from the shadow banks, and other elements of debt. So why does this matter? Because the economic, let's say that the average interest rate on debt is about 7%. Right now, the long-term benchmark rate is 6.15. The shadow banks charge upwards of 10%. So if you average it out, it might be 6 or 7%. So if you triple that, that means you have to get 18 to 20% GDP real growth every year just to cover the debt. And clearly, that's not happening. And so if that doesn't happen, then either you have to write off debt, or you have to, you have to come to some sort of, it's kind of odd how it's flashing. Is it doing that up there? I guess it doesn't matter. So you have to, you have to come to some, some resolution of that. You have to write off debt, or you have to, do something about it. So what the authorities have been doing, I think the fundamental problem for the authorities is that obviously there's a lot of debt being written off and being moved over to asset management companies or being quietly negotiated down, but it's nowhere near enough. And right now, servicing debt is consuming virtually all the credit resources in the economy. So this makes it very difficult for anybody else, people to get credit or get capital in order to build new capacity. There's also the problem that new capacity is not really in demand. But right now you have a situation, I would say, going on now for about 2 years, where you have almost a zombie economy effect, where you have virtually all the credit in the economy being issued to roll over old debt, very, very low credit demand in the rest of the economy, declining prices, particularly from manufacturers, an excess of commodities, excess of production, and very low demand. So that's the situation we're in right now. Growth in the economy, I would put, we don't do independent macroeconomic forecasting because the data set is too difficult to work with. So we use all the different data sets out of China all the time, and we do primary research to triangulate. And on a kind of anecdotal basis, growth in the economy would be a little bit sub-zero this quarter. You don't want to call it a recession because you don't necessarily have several quarters in a row that are sub-zero, but there's no way the economy is growing much. Well, thank you. I'll just sit here if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Because I would really like to make this a discussion and an exchange rather than a presentation, but let me try to set some of the, can I change, can I like move these?
We could bring the mobile.
Or,
That's a mobile. You can just bring that over to your lap if you'd like.
bring what over to my lap?
Does that come over?
I don't know what that is.
think
Oh,
that would just-
a keyboard.
The keyboard. Yeah,
Yeah.
they still have these for some reason.
Okay, well,
go.
I mean, it would be boring to go through anyway, but probably I will forget otherwise what I'm going to talk about, so we'll see whether this kind of works one way or the other. No. Anyway, we'll figure that out. What do you think?
Enter would be my guess. but
Enter.
Did that not work? Down
Enter.
here?
There we
Oh,
go.
There we go.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Oh, and I must have gotten some flash going there. I didn't realize that. Okay, so here's the way that I'd like to set the sort of framework of discussion. I find in my work that the attitude toward China internationally has shifted very dramatically over the last 2 years. And now the people I talk to, mostly the people I talk to are in money management. So they're in money management in the US and Europe, but also in politics and other areas. And I find that now the scope or the spectrum of discussion is China going to have a financial crisis soon? Or do we have 2 years of muddling through and is China sort of turning into Japan? That's the range of discussion now. The discussion doesn't even include, oh, well, is China, China is expanding and whatever problems it's getting through and the consumer is becoming more important and it's economically important. That stuff is gone. Also, all the number of times I was asked in the pre-2012 period to be on panels about innovation and Chinese technology was really, I honestly would rather have a root canal than go talk about that again. It was just a huge topic of discussion, disappeared. Now, it may be that people are sick of me, which is also probably the case, but I think also the topic has dwindled in importance because it's become clear that Chinese technology is not projecting into the international world anymore as the financing for technology in other industries falls. So what I'd like to start with is, why does debt really matter? So debt in China, we can all agree, is enormous. There's a range of estimates for the size of debt compared with GDP. There's discussion about the size of debt, how much is double counting. There's discussion about the size of GDP. But I think we can pretty much all agree that it's in the range of 200 to 300% of GDP. Outstanding